What is up, everybody? Welcome to the channel. This is Lulu Vico's channel and this is Overload.
This is Kai.
So recently Tony Northrup released a video talking about that high ISO does not introduce extra noise to your images.
High ISO does not cause high noise.
And today we would like to discuss whether this is true or not. So in the very beginning we want to discuss about the theory behind the sensors. As we know, there are mainly two types of sensors. CCD
CMOS.
and CMOS, right? So nowadays, most of the cameras, like DSLRs,
Using the
mirrorless,
CMOS.
using the CMOS camera, CMOS sensors. So the major difference between the CMOS and CCD sensors are basically the CMOS sensor has an individual amplifier circuitry behind each pixels or small pixel groups. So in this way, they can do the data processing and data readout in massive parallel, boost up the continuously shooting speed and time for starting. So here I have a brief summary of what Tony did in his channel. He basically made 4 groups of comparisons. So first comparison, he uses a quarter second exposure speed with f2.8 aperture, and for 2 images, one is set to ISO 100 and the other one is set to 6400.
The high ISO image is brighter, so we know high ISO causes bright images.
After adjusting these 2 images in the Lightroom to make it equally exposed.
Some of the highlights have been clipped, so we know high ISO images can clip the highlights even in a RAW file.
But he found out that the noise in 6400 is actually lower than the image that shoot with the ISO 100.
Looking closely, the high ISO image definitely does not show more noise. In this example, high ISO has less noise because the camera has a dual gain sensor.
So this just makes us wonder, what is the reason that causes this? And I mean, it's basically not fit our common sense. As we know, starting from the film photography, we know that increasing the ISO definitely increases the noise. The film does, and we think digital sensor should have these characteristics as well. But why would this happen? So personally, as a engineer in the optoelectronic industry who has been working on sensors for many years, I think camera is one of my things, at least. So there are 2 fundamental reasons that I could explain why this happened. First of all, adjust your images in post by just dragging the exposure bar to the right is basically multiply that many times of
Both the noise and the signal.
Right. Because when you first capture the image, each sensor captures both signal and noise. But when you adjust it in post, you are basically changing both signal and the noise all together. So that's why you're going to introduce more noise. And also this is the reason why that we say that editing the picture in post doesn't equal to raising your ISO when you're shooting the film. That image that Tony was taken in his house. It's an indoor situation that without any artificial lighting. So we can see it's a very contrasty scene that has a very shining window and has a dark piano next to it. If you want to expose your image with a quarter of a second and f2.8, I would say your ISO could be easily bump up to 1600 or something. So for example, if we have a 1600 here, the ISO 6400 is this much distance away from it. The 100 is about here. So as you can see, the 6400 is much closer to the correct exposure. And therefore, it is not because of the low ISO that creates this extra noise. It is because of
The distance.
falls more far away from the actual exposure. Plus, you adjusting more exposure in the post that both together gives you extra noise in the picture. And this is basically my thought. And we're gonna take some images and prove this concept. Let's go. So here in this park, and we found a scene that both has a very bright sunlight highlights and shadows created by the camera bag and the trees. So we're gonna shoot 3 groups of photos. The first group with the same shutter speed and aperture settings and only changing the ISO to change the exposure level. And this is also what Tony did in his channel. The second group, we're gonna shoot a couple of photos with 0 exposure compensation plus minus 1 plus minus 2 stops of exposure compensations to compare whether it is the offset of ISO comparing to the ideal exposure ISO that creates extra noise. For the last group, we're going to shoot more photos with the same amount of light that's shining into the camera sensor. So we're going to set the camera to aperture priority and use the light meter to measure the right amount of exposure. And we will let the camera choose the shutter speed. So we're going to start with ISO 100 and raise it up to 12,800 to see with the same amount of light going into this camera whether a high ISO could create higher noise. Okay, now we finished shooting all the images, and let's go to the computer and see how these two cameras performs.
Okay, so now I have imported all the photos in Lightroom. And as we can see, all these photos have been adjusted to the same exposure. And the first 4 photos are actually taken with the same shutter speed and the aperture settings. So the first photo is shot with the ISO set to 100, and the second one set it to 3200, while the third one was set to 6400, and the last one set it to 800, and this one is considering as the correct exposure. So let's first compare the first one, the ISO 100, to the second one, the ISO 3200. Let's zoom in to 4:1. Okay, now clearly we can see that the ISO 3200 has a much less noise than ISO 100. Although they are all adjusted to ISO 800 equivalent, but still in this mid-tone area, the ISO 3200 has a better noise performance. Now let's switch to the 6400. Still, you can see the noise pattern is pretty similar, but I would say still the right-hand side, the 6400, has a little bit better performance in terms of noise and also the color. So this just makes me wonder why low ISO performs worse than high ISOs, just like what Tony proposed in his channel. Actually, there are 2 main reasons that's caused this effect. First, adjusting your photos in post-processing, like softwares like Lightroom, does not equals to changing the ISOs when you're taking the shot, because they are under different mechanisms. You may wonder that I'm shooting the photos with the RAW file, and basically it means every sensor information got captured into the memory card. I can process it without losing any details or information. This is true, but when you're doing post-processing in Lightrooms, especially when you're changing the exposure, the computer will only read those data and multiply by certain values. The computer gonna read these raw files as a stream of 0 and 1s. And when you're adjusting the exposure, for example, increase by 1 stop, then the computer just gonna multiply the brightness by 2. Therefore, you're basically amplifying both the signal and the noise. However, when you shoot a photo and you want to increase the ISO instead of post-processing it, the camera sensor gonna have more gain than lower ISOs. And with all the circuitry and designs and filters, in certain region, the signal can be amplified much stronger than the noise. Therefore, in other words, you are making a better signal-to-noise ratio, and thus explains why a little bit higher ISO provides better noise pattern. This is because when we take this shot, we measure the actual appropriate exposure at that time, and it was 800, and the ISO 100 can be considered as 3 stops underexposed. Therefore, even though 800 ISO intrinsically gives you more gain to both signals and noise, but due to the low signal-to-noise ratio of ISO 100, because the sensor is not getting enough light, and when you're post-processing it, you are both amplifying the signal and the noise. Therefore, the ISO 800 is still perform better than ISO 100. So that's my explanation to Tony's experiment, and with his conclusion that low ISO generates more noise is not true, in my opinion. And to further compare it, I also take another photo set with 5 photos from the correct exposure, ISO 6400 with 200th a second and f4, to 1 stop lower and over 2 stop lower exposed, and a little bit over 1 stop exposure and a little bit over 2 stop exposure. So this is like a bracketing based on the the ISO settings. So if we compare the correct exposure on the right-hand side and the most overexposed 3200 images, here's the result. The right-hand side photo definitely has a little bit higher gain than the correct exposure. Now let's switch to the most underexposed image. Still, the results are similar. But what if we compared these two photos? One is underexposed, one is overexposed. We can see they perform roughly the same. But if you look at the details of the shadows, I would say still the 3200 performs a little bit better. It keeps more details of the strip compared to the 320 ISO. So what is the reason of causing that? Even though the 3200 has a little bit more overexposed than the amount of stops that the 320 ISO exposure. The reason being, again, when I shot this ISO 320 image, since there's not enough gain in the sensor, so the light going into the sensor and converted into an electrical signal is not strong enough compared to the noise of the circuitry generates. Therefore, for these two images, the signal to noise ratio are different, and actually the left-hand side is a little bit higher than the right-hand side. And this explains why Tony could get that conclusion, which he claims that the low ISO produce higher gain. It is not because of the ISO. It is because when he was taking that photo in a dark environment, like indoor situation, the lighting is not good, especially in the piano area. So with that shutter speed and aperture settings, the correct exposure should be roughly around 1600. When he took the shot under 3200 ISO, it can be considered as one stop overexposed. However, if you take it at 100 ISO, then you are 4 stops underexposed. So the more you offset your camera exposure by adjusting ISO from the proper exposure, the more noise you're gonna get in your final images. So this is my conclusion. And also to prove it further, I took a series of 5 photos with aperture priority settings. Basically, let the camera to meter the correct exposure and manually set the ISOs to forcing the camera to use that ISO setting. So here, let's compare an extreme case, ISO 100 versus ISO 12800. Clearly, the low ISO gives you better noise control. Hands down, this is how electronics works. Even if you compare these two, although it's one stop difference, still the lower ISO gives you better performance in terms of noise. If you let the camera to set it to the same amount of light that going into the camera. You may be wondering why I'm saying the same amount of light going into the camera, because the shutter speed are different. This is because when you increase your ISO by 1 stop, the camera, the sensor, knows that those diodes, those photodiodes, gonna be more sensitive to the incident light. Therefore, to compensate that effect, you have to make the shutter speed 1 stop faster. Therefore, all these 3 settings combined gives you a constant light input. That's the reason I'm saying the same amount of light that going into the sensor. So to conclude, the low ISO does not introduce extra gains. It is the amount of offset you're using that from the proper exposure that gives you extra noise to the image. After all, it is still that simple rule that if you want a good image, just trying to use the best exposure that you could get. Not underexposed, not overexposed. Getting the best exposure gonna guarantee you to get the best image quality. Okay, guys, this concludes my comparison about the ISO this time. Hope you like it. Please click the like button if you enjoyed it and subscribe to my channel. We have a lot more videos coming up. See ya.